What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel and thank you for joining me for another video. So right now I'm on my way home from work. This is just kind of a sequel to my initial reveal of the Honda Rebel 500 here. I kind of want to just go over just a little synopsis and a tiny review of this bike. We'll call this my 500 mile review. I've actually done exactly 551 miles according to my Trip B there. Well, 552 now, since I got this bike, since I reset the trip meters when I first purchased it. One for tracking fuel and the other one I'm just kind of tracking about when it's time to get an oil change next. So what have I learned about this bike in the last 500 miles that I can kind of go over with you guys? First and foremost, I love the bike. I feel like I have a really good rider connection with it. It's very easy to ride, it's lightweight, it gets great gas mileage. I think it has the right amount of power, especially in the right spots of the RPM band. It has really nice torque. So it picks up torque really low, really early, and you get a lot of available torque really down low, where a new rider would need it. And not just a new rider, but an experienced rider is going to want it. I mean, really, you can drop... I'm in 6th gear right now, okay, for example. We're doing 50 miles per hour, and this thing is just lumping along right now. But if I want to pass somebody like this van next to me, I can crack it open, and the torque just starts to build, like, immediately. And I mean... judging by sound, since this motorcycle doesn't have an RPM gauge, I'd say that was no more than maybe 4,500 RPM of its available 9,000 RPM. So you got a lot of torque available to you really down low, really early, and it makes this bike very fun to ride. You never really feel like you have to wring out its neck to get a little bit of grunt out of it. It's just available and it's ready to go. So I really like the motor in this bike, and I really like the way that it makes power. This bike is probably like the polar opposite of the Benelli 600's power band. Whereas the Benelli, you really had to crank that motor out to get it to start giving you that nice torque and horsepower up top. This bike gives it to you right away, and then it dies off a little bit in the upper band, but it's not terrible. I'd have to say that the power band on this bike is so flat, you really can't even judge when you're about to hit redline. Sometimes you'll just hit it on accident, and since there's no RPM gauge, you just never know that it's coming. But with that being said, you're not really going to find yourself doing that too often, because you'll be short shifting this bike so much because there's no need to wring it out. The other thing that I'm absolutely enjoying about this bike right now is the handling. I don't know if it's just the fat tire up front or what, but this thing just feels so stable in a turn. And it's so lightweight and flickable. I mean, it just goes exactly where you want it to. Now that fat tire up front, it really helps to keep this bike nice and straight on the highway. Granted, it's lightweight. It will get you blown around by very harsh winds just ever so slightly, but compared to something a little bit lighter like the KTM Duke 390 or a Ninja 400 and bikes like that, this bike holds its own on the pavement on the highway a whole lot better. So touching on the highway capabilities of this bike while we're here, I think that this bike is plenty capable for highway use, granted its small engine displacement. Compared to something like the Duke 390, Ninja 400, and so on and so forth, which are fantastic bikes for the highway as well, this one holds its own on the highway just fine, just like those bikes. I feel like this one has a slight advantage because of the stability, but power-wise, I'd say they all feel about the same. Now, I don't know if you can hear it or not, but I am experiencing a very strong headwind, and that always happens when I'm heading north on the 15. But I'd have to say, the Rebel 500 is handling it just fine. I am having to make some slight corrections here and there because the gust is just, it's so strong. But compared to my KTM Duke 390 that I used to own, this is nothing, it's cake. And I do have this very small fly screen up front here. I believe it's made by Moto or Moto, something like that. It's effective a tiny bit, but it's not like the most effective windscreen on the planet. It's not very tall. I don't feel like this bike, you know, necessarily needs a gearing change when it comes to freeway use. up here at 80 miles per hour, I feel like the motor is relatively happy. It doesn't feel necessarily very buzzy. It's relatively smooth. It's not a problem at all. And you know, I'm doing 80 miles per hour. I have no RPM gauge. I can't tell you what the motor's revving to, but if I had to guess, I'd say it's around 6,000 RPM. And it only has an available 9,000 RPM. But since the gearing is relatively tall, it's not too much of an issue. It feels really relaxed, just scooting along at freeway speeds. So next thing I'm going to touch on just lightly as well is the fuel mileage. This bike gets absolutely insane, like fantastic fuel mileage. So far I've been averaging about 58 to 60 miles per gallon, and it doesn't seem to matter like how hard or how soft I really ride the bike. It gets like the same fuel mileage no matter what. And I haven't really done a whole lot of like just mostly inner city commuting. Like I mostly have it on the highway to and from work. I've also done one weekend with it where I went out with my fellow guys and we hit some canyons. And I mean, I spent a lot of time at wide open throttle, either on the freeway, spending, you know, trying to keep up with them. And I've actually had this up to 108 miles per hour, which is just slightly faster than the KTM 392, which is surprising. But I mean, the bike does have a little bit extra power, even though it weighs a little bit more. And that day, I still managed to get 60 miles per gallon. And I mean, I was riding the bike hard all day. And I went about 106 miles total. Decided to go fill up at the gas station on my way home. I still had, I think I was down to 1 bar, but it wasn't flashing yet, which you can see now. It actually just started flashing about 2 miles ago at 133 miles, but it started flashing, so, or no, it wasn't flashing, it was solid. So I decided to go to the gas station anyways and just kind of see how much it would take. And I was only able to get in, I believe, 1.8 gallons. So it was like 60 miles per gallon, like on the dot. And I was just so surprised. I was like, oh my God. I'm like, how? I just thrashed this bike, like wide open throttle, top speed pulls. Like I was riding the bike hard for most of those miles. Now there was a little bit of downtime spent by the beach and the ocean front where we were just cruising along, but for the most part, I was on the highway or on those back canyon roads just giving it all she had. And that's where I really noticed that the handling on this bike is really, really good. Now, you can't keep the pace of the sport bikes, and trust me, I tried for a second and I really had to back off because I went into a couple turns a little too fast, and the suspension on this bike can absolutely not handle turns that are way too quick. The suspension's very soft, and I'm not complaining about it. It is very comically oversprung, so to speak. It's very bouncy in the front. Now, you don't really notice it while you're riding. Like, you hit bumps and it doesn't sit there and start pogo sticking or anything like that. But if you come to a stop and you know the weight transfer when you stop, it kind of like bounces for a second and then it stops. But if you stand up, hold the brakes, and really like just start bouncing it, it's comical like how much of just using your body weight you can get the front suspension to compress. It's hilarious. But the ride is it's pretty comfortable, and I mean, for my weight and my height and everything, it definitely does daily riding duties just fine. But do not expect this thing to really get aggressive in the corners with the stock suspension setup. You really should consider grabbing, you know, an aftermarket set of shocks for the rear and an aftermarket set of cartridges for the front, which Öhlins does actually make an aftermarket set of cartridges and shocks for this bike. And I want to say Two Brothers Racing does as well. I'm not 100% sure, but I do believe I have seen their products online as well. Now, you're going to pay a pretty penny for that, so it's up to you if it's worth it or not. I do plan on keeping this bike for a while, and I know I've said that before about the Z1000, and I said it about every bike I probably ever have owned. I mean, I'm kind of losing count, but I want to say this is the 11th or 12th bike I've ever owned in my 9 years of motorcycling experience. And I've had 4 of them alone. since getting here to San Diego. So, or actually no, I miscounted. I had the Suzuki Katana when I first moved here, which I sold immediately after buying because I just didn't like it. So that was one. Then I had the Ninja 300 as a temporary solution, and while I was saving up for my Duke. That's 2, and then I've had 4, so that's 6 in total. I've had 6 bikes since basically July of 2019. I mean, it is what it is. I've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed the experience, and the only bike that I've really, like, you know, paid for is really the Duke, because that's the only bike that I never sold for money. I traded it, and then these last 3 bikes, they were all title trades. So I mean, I've gotten to experience 4 motorcycles in the last year for the low price of basically 3,500 bucks. It just, you know, it worked out for me. And would I do it again? I don't know, probably absolutely. Would I do it differently? Yes. Absolutely. I would try to make it to where I didn't have to go through 4 bikes in the last year. I would probably just take my time and kind of consider not rushing into things. Now, did I rush into this bike? Not really. I mean, I had my Benelli posted for a solid 2 weeks. I tried not to chase anybody myself. I tried to let bikes come to me. But I mean, I had a couple bites for people that wanted to come look at the Benelli but would never show up. So at a certain point I said, you know what, I'm just gonna start looking for trades again, because ultimately I wanted to sell it and I wanted to try and buy an MT-07, but it never worked out, and I'm impatient, and it is what it is. But I mean, lucky for me, I mean, this worked out. I love this bike. I think it's absolutely fantastic. It does everything that I need it to without being over the top. It doesn't push me to ride harder, and that was the other thing. I really wanted to calm down my riding habits because, you know, I've got young kids at home, I've got a wife, and I care about them, and I want to be able to come home and see them every day. And I'm not going to give up riding to do that, but I'm going to make the subtle changes that I need to make sure that it doesn't end up being my fault. Because with the sportier bikes that I've owned, you know, even down to the 390, they just always begged to be ridden hard, and I can't do it anymore. It's just not the life for me. All right, let's see what the trip meter's at. We're at 139.9. I'm just gonna call it 140. Now, that's another nice thing about this bike, is it only requires 87 octane, unlike the Benelli and the Z1000 and the Duke that require premium. Now, I usually stick the nozzle all the way in, and then I wait for it to click when it reaches the top point of where the nozzle is. There is a nozzle stop in there that doesn't let you stick it all the way down. So I like to let it go till it clicks, and then I usually try to fill up the filler neck here just a little bit too. I try to get it to the same point every time. So there we go, we got our click. And then I just try to fill this up a little bit as well without going over the top. All right, so there we are, 2.4 gallons. All right, so we called it 140 miles divided by 2.46, and we are at 57 miles per gallon this time. Still not bad. Go ahead and reset our trip meter. I love the way that this Two Brothers Racing exhaust sounds. It's probably a lot more bassy and deep in person to me than it is for you guys. You might get a better sense for it if you're using headphones right now, but I think that this exhaust sounds fantastic on this bike. I believe that the parallel twin, this standard firing order that this bike uses, because this is not a 270-degree crank, unfortunately, which the new Rebel 1100 is, and it sounds more V-twin like. This has the standard firing order, basically like Kawasaki does. It's not the most exotic noise in the world, but I feel like that noise suits this bike better than it does the sport bike counterparts. Like, I can imagine this exhaust noise right now coming out of a CBR 500R, and just being kind of awkward. Like, I don't think that it fits the look of the CBR. Maybe the CB500F, you know, the naked bike, I could see it fitting with that bike a little bit, but like when it comes to a bike that, you know, kind of mimics its big brother, the CB1000, yeah, I don't know. A bike that's trying to look like its big brother, it just, it doesn't fit. See if we can get a little bit of noise from it right now. Yeah, it sounds pretty good, especially like if you just blip it like that. It's got a nice like deep rumble. It's at a point in the rev range where you don't really hear like the parallel kind of firing order yet. You know, that's kind of what it sounds like in the upper RPMs. You know, you really start to hear that parallel kind of sound, and it's not the most exotic thing in the world, but like I said, it fits this bike better than the sport bike counterparts. But that's my brief little 500-mile review of the Rebel 500. If you guys want to know anything or see anything about this bike in the meantime, let me know, and I'll definitely come up with some video ideas for you guys. Don't forget to leave a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys in the next video.